for the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse. Welcome to the coolest place to be every Tuesday at noon Eastern. If you think changing our workplaces will change our world, we have a special healthcare edition of the Ethicsverse today with the one and only Leslie Bowles. How's it going, Leslie? Round of applause for Leslie. Let's welcome her back with a massive emoji explosion. Nobody's had lunch yet. We are ready to get moving here. What's happening, Leslie?
Nothing. Thank you again for having me today. I appreciate it.
You're always such a treat, you know?
I try to be. No matter where I go, I try to be.
Exactly. So like we say all the time on the Ethicsverse, your link or your network is your net worth. Neither are big enough. So drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat, connect with one person. Particularly in healthcare, we have to take advantage of this unique asset that we have, which is this collegial, industry that we're in. I say this all the time. I say this to my kids. You get no bonus points for reinventing the wheel. So any challenge that you're facing, odds are there's somebody on this webinar today that has encountered that problem and come up with a solution. So reach out and build that network and take advantage of the collegial nature of this industry because it's super unique and we don't utilize this point of leverage enough. Speaking of points of leverage, there is so much thought leadership coming out. I'm listening to podcasts constantly when I'm walking my dog at night. He doesn't like the lack of attention he gets, but I'm trying to feed the brain here. You know what I mean? So hit this QR code. You can check out the Ethico library. There's a bunch of great books coming out. And as always, the Ethico book giveaway, world famous book giveaway is in live effect. We're giving away, we had Allison on the main show a week or so ago. So we're going to keep pushing this book because this book was, this is like a soothsayer's book. She really saw around the curve here. And so much of what she talks about in the book, if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. But keep those comments coming. We want to keep this very conversational. Speaking of conversational, I want to share with you the Ethics Experts, the fastest growing ethics and compliance podcast in the world. It's a top 2% global podcast. People love business ethics, and we got a lot of great content coming out. So we always just want to add value to this network, to this industry, because we're approaching this inflection point, like I talk about often, that the next 10 years can look way different than the last 10 years, but it's going to take us doing things differently. And we all have this natural goal-seek mechanism, this tool that we're born with in our, which is our mind. And all we have to do is feed that good information. We have to feed that good conversations, good ideas. And that subconscious mind it's crazy. It automatically sort of solves problems. But it's on us to have that intentionality to keep putting good stuff in there. So check out the Ethics Experts, great content. Not my words. I didn't say that. They said it, okay? Speaking of the ecosystem, Ethico is the compliance 3.0 solution, particularly for healthcare. So if you have a vendor that's not Ethico, it might be worth checking us out. We're not right for everybody, and that's all good, but our business is purpose-built for healthcare. We have over 80% of our clients are healthcare clients. And so a lot of good stuff coming out of that. We sort of speak your language and so forth. So we have a really great promotion coming up. So I'm going to share this promotion with you, and I'm going to share a couple of pieces of feedback that warm my heart. I read these before bed at night. Marissa, she is our lead on implementations. Everybody's so nervous about implementations and what a pain it is to change houses and change vendors. So we put a lot of effort, a lot of resources into that change management support side of the equation to make that as smooth as possible. So Marissa was by far the best implementation manager I've ever worked with. I've done a lot of implementations in HR and ethics and compliance over my 20-year career. And I must say, Marissa receives first place. Round of applause for Marissa. Very responsive, great listener to understand our business needs, give suggestions after understanding our needs, always available to jump on a call, a true partner. She's an expert at solving problems and making the client feel heard and understood. I often felt like we were on the same team. That's exactly what I want. I want our company to be an extension of our client's business. I want us to add value constantly and make your life easier. So if you're with somebody else and you got a little heartburn about all the acquisition and all the private equity activity, or you feel like you bought something 5 or 10 years ago that hasn't sort of kept pace with the promises that were made, it might be worth checking out Ethico. We have up to a year free. Of course, some restrictions apply, and up to a 15% discount of what you're paying right now. So if, check it out. I think you'll love it. We have exit interviews, case management, issue intake. We have disclosure forms. We have all the things that you need to crowdsource risk intelligence and make your program more effective. Speaking of effectiveness, all right, I'm wrapping up here. Speaking of effectiveness, Ethico is about to launch our benchmark report. It's the answer to the NAVEX benchmark report. That's a general industry one, but also in about a week or two, we're putting out the healthcare specific one. We have a large enough data set of several 100,000 reports concentrated in healthcare, which allows us to get some really, insightful insights. Okay, some insightful, takeaways that are all focused on healthcare. So if you feel like benchmarking against the general economy because healthcare is so different is not as good, well, then you should check out the Ethico benchmark report, the healthcare benchmark report, which is coming out soon. There should be a link in the chat for that. So that's coming. All right. Here you go. You got Nick and Leslie. We kind of got our Game of Thrones, sort of space Game of Thrones vibes. We're looking good, and we are ready to dive into our session today. So today's session, we're talking about a couple of things. Education is the key to success, but we're going to try to break down how applying a risk-based strategy to our healthcare compliance program in conjunction with continuous education can really drive some great results. So Leslie, why don't you give us a little frame for the conversation? We'll just dive in, but keep those questions and comments coming in the chat, and we'll weave them in organically like we always do.
Yeah, sure. Well, once again, thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure and honor to speak with you. So one of the things that we were kind of discussing when we were talking about putting this together was risk-based approach to compliance. It's extremely important in healthcare. I think one of the reasons why it's vitally important in healthcare is because there's so much types of regulation and guidelines that oversee our industry. And I think it can become overwhelming for compliance officers to think about everything that they need to do. And taking a risk-based approach helps you. It's almost like taking a pill for anxiety. It helps you to breathe, right? It allows you to focus on what's essential and important for your organization while still being in the know, but being more focused on what's specific to us. What do I need to focus on? And then the education piece really helps you to couple, I feel like it's a rounder of your compliance program, right? To say, yes, we're doing all this auditing and monitoring, but to also say we're also educating on these key areas that are really high risk to our organization and high risk to our entity, I think is extremely important. So I'm excited for this conversation today about it.
I'm excited too. You said some great stuff in that intro that you guys are gonna see throughout the rest of the conversation. So for our first question, how do you think healthcare organizations can move beyond the sort of trendy industry-wide risks and develop, targeted compliance strategies for their particular business? I think there's a lot of noise. There is a lot of perfectionism in our industry, and at some level, there's sort of some of the guidance feels ethereal sometimes. It feels too vague. It doesn't, it's like, well, okay, great. I understand that concept, but how do I actually put that into practice? You mentioned kind of this risk-based approach, but how do we sort through kind of the trendy things, the things everybody is talking about, and really have that lens that's specific to our business?
Well, I would start with something that I started doing for myself most recently. I'm not going to every conference anymore, right? Because the reason why I say that, it's not to knock the different conferences that are out there, but what often ends up happening is you often overwhelm yourself with the amount of information that you receive. All that information is not specific to your organization. And I think being strategic about what sort of continuous education or what sort of information you need to retain is also really important for you to be the best compliance officer that you can be for your organization. I would start there. I think, the second approach is realizing that information is just information until you utilize it, right? And so, again, not every single organization is going to have the same level of risk. And I think that is really, really important, or the same type of risk, rather. I think that's really, really important for everyone, all of us as compliance professionals, to evaluate, right? Not everything is applicable to me. And so trying to create this cookie cutter program, it just doesn't work anymore. We're headed into an environment, even from a technology standpoint, with the introduction of artificial intelligence. Everybody's talking about that. I think it's really, really important to start really molding your program into the risk that is at your organization and your entity.
I think so much of the challenge, though, is like you kind of don't know what you don't know.
Sure.
You probably have a sense that there are risks, but you don't know the extent of it. You don't know the severity of it or the occurrence of it. And then, again, back to the information overload from the guidance. Like, to your point, not every piece of guidance or not every freaking blog post you read is like a mandate to do that particular thing. Like, you have to set,
exactly.
There's that saying of like, you have to kind of like set your own plate, otherwise someone's just going to keep dumping stuff onto your plate. if somebody is like, yes, I like this, but I don't really kind of know where to start, what advice would you give them? Where would you give them? Where should they kind of drill to like to that pool of confidence to, because like it takes a confidence to say like, okay, yes, that's interesting, but I don't need to mess with that right now, right? And that's opening yourself up to risk in theory. So like, how do you help somebody to kind of see through that and get that confidence to say no?
Sure. So one of the things that I think all organizations need to do, including healthcare, is to start looking at your own data. I mean, data is where you find risk. I think oftentimes we look at the guideline or the regulation before we look at the data, right? Data is what drives you to identify predictive risk, right? Or risk, you can predict certain types of risk. It also can help you to identify your run-of-the-mill, like we like to say, risk. And it also can help you identify where others are externally are looking at you. And if you really think about it, most external agencies, all external agencies, federal, commercial, payers, from a healthcare perspective, they're looking at your data. So why are you not looking at your data? I always am so confused by that. And data, to me, is the key driver of how you really develop a risk-based approach. Now, I know some would argue, I don't have time to look at my data. Well, you need to make it, right? Because when you think about something as simple as reimbursement from a healthcare perspective, there are tons of information in claim data. And if you would take the time, it's almost like, and this is why I love compliance and the investigative aspects, because it's like peeling back an onion.
Exactly.
Sometimes people think of healthcare reimbursement. They think of, okay, well, that's just coding and billing. But no, coding and billing can tell you a lot about things related to Stark or anti-kickback or the quality of care. And so if you start to utilize data in a way in which you're sort of putting or unpeeling an onion, if that makes sense, it'll really help you with identifying where your true risk is. So I would say one thing is data. Another thing, if I can mention, and this is what I've learned from all of my great mentors, talk to people. Talk to people. Talk to your key stakeholders. I think it's one thing to sit in your office and sort of say, okay, we might have some here, we might have here. But like you said, you don't know what you don't know. And since you don't know it, get out there and talk to some of the people that do, right? Your frontline managers, your mid-level managers. It's like amazing to me because over the course of my career, we have identified some of the biggest aha moments by just having conversations. And so I think it's really important to incorporate two things, right? Data and communication. And if you're not, you really need to evaluate the way you're sort of running your program.
I love what you said about data. I mean, it can get so overwhelming, right? Like if you look at a register of of all the reports that you got in the last year, or you look at all the billing and coding stuff, like it can be thousands and thousands of lines and that can be overwhelming. Like, how do I find any patterns in it? But to your point, you can just aggregate that higher and higher and higher, and you can de-aggregate that lower and lower and lower. You can zoom in and out at various different levels. And usually, in my experience, at a higher level, you can still get kind of 80% correct. And so this is really a game, this is really a game of continuous improvement, and it's a game of iteration. It's a game of like hypothesis testing. And so if you see something in a data that's a little bit of a higher level, not the sort of super granular, every single, record in your entire case management system or in your billing program, you can develop some kind of a hypothesis on that higher level and start to like iterate through that and dive a little bit deeper. I think we always get overwhelmed, or I'll just say, it feels like there's an overwhelmedness, if that's a word, with respect to data analytics, because we have data scientists and queries and all these things that like we haven't really come in contact with. But in actuality, like data analysis is very simple. It could be tally marks on a Post-it note. It could be stepping on the scale. It could be balancing your checkbook. Like we engage in data analytics all the time. In applying, and it's not a different animal inside of our business versus inside of our personal bank account. You know what I mean?
Sure. No, I agree. And I think, too, to what you're saying, one of the best things any compliance officer or compliance professional can do for their program is just to admit to themselves, I need help. I can't do all of this by myself, right? I think we also have to reevaluate the positions that are in our programs, right? So there used to be all this conversation about how do we ask for more resources? But I think the question that we need to ask now is how do we repurpose the resources that we have to fit where we are going? I think that's becoming essential. I'm seeing very large healthcare organizations and organizations across the U.S., they are hiring data scientists in their compliance departments. That makes absolute sense, right? Because now we have more information, we have more data, and we have to do something with it. It's extremely important to do so. And I think the other part is, I always like the compliance officer or the compliance professional that says, all right, this is an area, this is my weak area over here, whether it's coding and billing compliance, maybe it's privacy for someone else. I don't know, I'm just making this up. Maybe it's exclusion screening, and they go get a vendor, right? And they budget for that vendor, or they go get an external resource to help. That, to me, is a smart person, because what they're saying is I have the best interest of my organization in my mind, and this is an area where I know I need assistance. And I think you have to evaluate it from that standpoint. I think hiring with a purpose is important, right? Being intentional about, and this is the other thing, being honest about what you don't know, right? Be honest with yourself, because oftentimes compliance professionals are kind of dubbed as like just all around generalists. You're just so amazing. You know everything. And that is so not true at all. And so you have to be honest with yourself about what your areas of improvement are and where you can use some help and either repurpose or ask for those resources while taking a risk-based approach.
Yeah, and look, you're never going to de-risk the whole organization, right? That's never going to happen.
Never.
No. You're never going to have enough money. You're never going to have enough time. You're never going to have enough resources, right? Like that scarcity thing is built into our DNA as human beings, that desire for more. And so I think to your point, well, look, in my experience, you can usually do a lot more with less. I think there's sort of this illusion that if I have more people on my team, well, then those are just new labor units. Those are new automatons that are just going to be pushing papers appropriately. Those people need to be trained. That adds multiple layers of complexity. Just look up network theory and see what adding 3 more people to a team of 5 does in terms of multiplying the connection points. All those are new opportunities for like miscommunication and like, inefficiency. So I'm just saying that there is you hope as you add resources that there is a net sort of like efficiency gain, but I'm saying that there's always an offset that's involved with somebody joining the team. So my point is,
Sure.
if we can live our life and look at our program through this risk-based lens, we start to see a lot of different opportunities, and we start to delete out some of these things that we're holding as constant sort of constraints on our forward progress. You know what I mean? If we can look
Sure.
at it a little bit different and we recognize, look, there's always going to be some risk. So my job is to just apply the most effort, the most effective effort and focus toward those risks that are most meaningful. And I just have to keep iterating through that. Well, that gives us a lot more freedom to not live in that sort of stage of anxiety where we keep kind of, where we're kind of creating that self-fulfilling prophecy that reinforces the bad brand that many of us are trying to like break out of.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more.
So, we were talking a little bit about all the change that's going on. There's change going on at the federal level. There's a lot of anxiety in the general ethics and compliance space. There's a lot of anxiety in particular in the healthcare space around the changes and what does all this stuff mean. In our pre-show prep call, we were talking a little bit about this concept of agency and how whenever there's change, whenever there's the chaos of change always creates opportunities. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we can use this mode of relatively more volatility or more anxiety as an opportunity to sort of burst through and show that we are those sort of trusted advisors to the business, that true sort of business partner instead of this kind of, barnacle on the ship.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. We were specifically discussing the potential or the future cuts that are going to come to Medicaid expansion. And I think a lot of us are very, very uneasy about this, especially for healthcare systems that serve this population and this demographic. It just makes you extremely nervous. But I also see this as an opportunity, right? I see this as an opportunity for you to kind of reevaluate, okay, we've got these potential cuts coming, right? Here in compliance, there's probably some value that I can add to this equation. Now, if federally you have all these cuts happening, that means, well, in some states, and not saying this is just the prediction of Leslie Bowles, right? This is hypothetical for purposes of
Etch
this
it in
discussion.
stone. Write it down. Yeah.
But, you have the opportunity to now reevaluate. Okay, we've got Medicaid cuts coming. We have a certain amount of individuals that this will impact. This will mean, well, we'll want to help these individuals, but also how do we retain that reimbursement or ensure that we receive that reimbursement? Well, you have social determinants of health coding, right? SDOH coding helps identify it helps identify the areas that contribute to the care, sometimes that impact the way in which these patients deal with chronic conditions, acute conditions, whatever the case may be. Here you have an opportunity. All right, we probably need to start using these SDOH codes because we can collect data on these patients or this demographic and then use that data to go back to the state to figure out what programs will best help our population. And there you have a scenario where compliance becomes a value add to the business, right? With this sort of futuristic thought process by saying we're going to prepare early by examining or evaluating areas where we may not be using social determinants of health coding or may not be documenting SDOH appropriately. And we're going to use these particular areas to help our organization. And I think I come from the mindset of using what people like to call tribulations as opportunities, right? This is where I feel like I do my best work in being able to identify, okay, we know we have this problem coming. We don't want to wait till the problem gets here to provide a solution. So how can compliance be a value add? Well, example here is education, right? Educating the providers, educating your coders and your billers and your CDI team and all of that good stuff. And it contributes to we're all reaching for the same outcome, right? But now it gives us this sort of just pathway to really assisting the business, because oftentimes compliance is looked at as, sending the business in the wrong direction, especially in healthcare. No one likes to necessarily see you come in sometimes. But I think thinking about compliance proactively is one of the things that all of us need to evaluate now, right? How can we move? Because I know sometimes we have to be reactive. That's sometimes part of just our industry. But I think one of the things that's really important is for us to develop a proactive mindset. And I think this conversation around this upcoming Medicaid cuts is a really good way because everyone's talking about it. The other thing you can look at is how do I work hand in hand with my revenue integrity departments or my revenue cycle departments, right? To ensure that, all right, well, this is a good time for us to really evaluate the way in which we're collecting and coding and billing, which a lot of us do anyway. But now it's intentional, right? Because now we have this potential revenue cut that may come. And so if that hits 20% of our revenue, the other 80% has to be tight. It has to be good. And so this is a good time for compliance to get involved with revenue integrity, because lots of times I have seen in my experience that sometimes the way in which we audit on the compliance side does bring value to how you can teach your operational folks to really look at it differently by looking at it from a reg standpoint versus, volume and how much money did we leave on the table, which both serve a purpose, but I think we're coming into a place where both are needed equally. And so there's all sorts of innovative ways for us as compliance professionals to really create, some good drive-through when it comes to what's happening in the future.
Yeah, you are the architect of your destiny. It's up to you to change this brand. It's up to you to change the way you interact with the business. And I just, if you think about what a brand is, you think about what a reputation is, it's just a series of impressions. And some of those impressions are valid and some of them are not valid. So again, the opportunity and the tribulation, as Leslie said, is here right now. If you're dealing with that kind of a brand problem in your organization, or you stepped into a program that has a reputation that is sort of contrary to the vision you have for that program, this is the opportunity to get proactive. I mean, we have to break these cycles. We have to break these patterns. If we don't want to be reactive all the time, if we don't want to be brought in after the fire started, we want to spend more of our time proactive. We want to spend more of our time on fire prevention, so to speak. We want to be viewed as that, trusted advisor to the business. Guess what? you now have an opportunity to connect directly to the top of the P&L. Okay. So ethics and compliance is always complaining about, how do we show the ROI? We're doing all these good things. Where is that impact? Now you can tie directly to the top line. This is a reimbursement issue. And so when you can position yourself inside your organization by attaching to that top line, by helping to see around the curve and helping to project forward and say, hey, there might be a reimbursement issue down the road. We know these cuts are coming. We at least need to have a little bit of a safety net here and find some of these other agencies that might be able to fill in some of the gaps. In order to do that, we need to make some changes to the operation. Guess what? Now you're integrated totally into the business. Now you're changing the DNA of the business. You're changing the processes of the business while at the same time repositioning yourself in the eyes of leadership who might have the wrong impression of you. So when I'm talking, this is exactly what Leslie's talking about. In the tribulation, in the trial, in the chaos, in the change, there's always an opportunity for us to walk forward with confidence and make the world, bend the world to our will, subdue your business and in terms of your will, because you have a very unique perspective. One other thing you just said here is that, revenue cycle, they have a certain vantage point. They have a certain thing that they have a certain way that they go about their business. They have certain KPIs that they're looking for, and they have certain levers that they pull. Those are there for a reason, and those work for a reason. In the midst of sort of volatility and chaos, the vantage point that compliance can provide, like Leslie just said, is so much more valuable. It can really fill in some of those gaps that their eyes are not on. Okay. So we have to find these kinds of opportunities, and it's a game of constant forward pressure. It's a game of, how football is like a game of inches. You're just constantly pushing down the field. That's what we need to do in terms of conquering more land. Land in this analogy is the hearts and minds of the stakeholders that we interact with up and down the leadership stack.
All right. No, I couldn't agree.
So how do we go about doing this? I mean, we talked about it a little bit. We kind of nerded out on this little rabbit hole, but how do we go about kind of assessing those risks and understanding which of these risks that are maybe in the, in the ether, bouncing around in the zeitgeist, we really need to pay attention to? Is it merely just having those relationships within the organization and being able to bounce, ideas off of folks? Like, how do we really start to take this concept and put it into action?
Yeah, I've always been nosy by nature, right? That's just, that's who I am. I own it. And I think one of the ways to start, because I believe conversation is good, right? Conversation always creates the launching pad for what you're trying to achieve. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. There was a moment in my career, I remember, where, we were looking at exclusion screenings. And so, we had this thought, like, exclusion screenings are being run by compliance, right? And then on the HR side, they're doing what you call those initial licensure checks. But once we met in the middle, we realized that, okay, so they're just screening at the time of hire for the license check. No one's screening thereafter. Yeah, we're checking the federal exclusion list, but who's really checking the licensure, the piece periodically to ensure that we're not missing things like inactive license? Yep, all those sort of things. And so that would have happened without a conversation. It seems really simple, but it would have happened if HR and compliance didn't sit down and have this conversation about it. And I believe, I think it's really important for compliance professionals to see if their organization is operating in silos, because lots of times that is where risk breeds. That's like the breeding ground for risk. And so, that's one way is conversation. We developed some really good risk assessments, and we develop risk assessments with different language for different levels of team members. I think that's really awesome. I've seen a lot of great versions of it. And I think that is an extremely, extremely important part of the communication process as well. And not just doing the risk assessment piece once a year. Some people look at me like I'm completely crazy. I actually talked to someone a while back, and they were looking at me like, Leslie, I don't have time to do that. But you have this issue over here that keeps reoccurring. You need to make time, right? Because the problem is we're not going back to reassess, because when we think of the word monitor, it's almost like we're going back in to check in and make sure it's not happening, but we're not really reassessing the area to ensure that the education we provided, that the plan, the corrective action plan actually stuck. So you have to go back and reevaluate the way you define monitor or reassess. I think that's a really important part too. And then I can't stress enough the importance of data. Data is extremely important, especially in healthcare. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's been so much recent enforcement activity around impossible days, right? Impossible days meaning days in which a provider can provide a certain amount of services, to patients in a day. So, for instance, if you look at your own data and you see Dr. X is seeing 500 patients in a day, but he worked 5 hours, that's humanly impossible. You don't, no one external needs to find that. You need to find that, because more than likely they're billing that way. And then if you have an RVU-based contract model, you're paying them that way. And so data to me is extremely important. It's something I talk about a lot. I talk about it just beyond reimbursement, because it really gives it, it's almost like putting your secrets out for everyone else to find. Your data are your secrets.
Good point.
And
Good point. Yeah, that's a great frame. That's a really important frame.
Yeah, it is. Who should know your secrets? More than you. You need to be looking at your secrets. The world should know your secrets before you do. And so I think data is a really, really important aspect as well. Definitely.
So I want to pivot a little bit into the training piece, because, what I see a lot, particularly in healthcare, I guess this is kind of across the board, but it seems to be a little bit more sort of, it seems to happen a little bit more in healthcare, where it's just kind of this plug and play training, where we just plug in the training for, a cadre of, courses that are healthcare, whatever courses, and we drop those in. And I think sometimes those don't end up kind of achieving the ends, and that approach can sometimes, it doesn't achieve the ends that we want. And sometimes that approach can ultimately reinforce the stereotype that we're trying to break out of. How can we sort of rethink about, about training and kind of moving beyond some of these traditional training approaches? Like, have you implemented some of these training approaches that have really driven some better engagement beyond click through while I'm watching something on YouTube? That's not how I do my training. Yeah. I'm just kidding. But you know what I'm saying? How do we break that pattern?
Yeah, well, I'm a big advocate of knowing your audience, right? And knowing who you're talking to and tailoring your training to them. I know for some of us, right, we've got to do what I like to call the click-through training, right? You have to do it. It's part of what you need to do, maybe because of the size of your organization or whatnot. But I do think that there are times where it causes you to get really creative in how you train. Like, for instance, there was one time in my career where the compliance officer that I was working with, and then also one of the managers and analysts at the time, we had a real issue with social media. It was a big problem. People were just doing the weirdest things, and I'll use the word weird, the strangest things. It's like, don't put PHI on social media. But no one was getting it. And so we decided to have a very direct and impactful education session that we rolled out across the organization just on social media. This is what we mean when we say, do not put PHI on social media. And we gave every scenario that we were encountering and we were having issues with. And I always used to say at almost every session, give me my Oscar when I'm done. But it was so impactful because it allowed people to understand exactly what we're trying to say. Because sometimes with adult learners, we don't take the time to realize that each adult learner has their own unique way of how they interpret and then how they retain the information, then apply what you just said. And so there are times that are called, and this could be organizational. This also could be departmental, right? Or this could be maybe a couple of individuals, wherever the risk lies. I think it's really important to provide targeted, focused training on those areas. I'll give you another example. One of the things that when I was coming up in my career, I noticed that doctors, they just did not want to be educated from compliance professionals at all. They used to see us come in, just think of us as like, the lowest of the low. And yeah. So I wanted to come up with unique ways to engage them, grab their attention, but also gain their respect, right? Because I needed their respect. I need you to listen to what I'm saying. I need you to document well, because that translates to great coding. That also translates to great outcomes for quality and other things for our organization, and reimbursement and revenue, and complying with the law. That one too, really important. So I started thinking of ways to engage the physicians. And one of the things that I came up with is, if I can't present material in a focused, specific way in 30 minutes or less, I'm not going to do this training. I'm going to go back to the drawing board and do it until I can. And that became really effective. Now, I'm not saying for you to kind of, put the same time restraints on yourself, but what I'm asking you to think about is the sort of the vehicle that you have your education in. Is it the same old Toyota? Can you put it in a Maserati this time and just put new rims on it and make it a little bit better, if you get my analogy here? And that's what I did. For me, 30 minutes or less, created this because I wanted to show the doctors this is important, but I don't want to waste your time, right? I don't want this long drawn out. I don't want to read every single coding guideline. I don't want to read every single Medicare guideline. I want to read the one that's specific to what you're doing. And then what ended up happening, this crazy thing started happening. The physicians started asking for education. It was the nuttiest thing.
Well, you proved that, like, you could be there. You know what I'm saying? Like, you proved to be an asset to them. I mean, again, if you feel like you're pushing into everything all the time, it's because that person doesn't think that you're an asset. And so that's just a framing exercise. That's just reframing a little bit. It's showing up a little bit differently. It's letting them have that aha moment and realize, like, oh, this person's on my team. They're not fighting against me. They're actually trying to make my life a little bit easier. But to your point, it requires us to wipe the slate clean. It requires us to, like, bring fresh eyes to these problems and not just sequester ourselves to the status quo approach that we've done for years. Okay. We always train with PowerPoints and then they're all an hour long. Okay. All training needs to be that way. That's a crazy constraint to place on the delivery of information. And, I talk about this a lot, but, like, you got to just solve the problem. What's the risk? What's the problem? How do I solve that? You don't have to bring a hammer to every single situation. You need a different tool for different scenarios and so forth. And we're living in an era right now where there's kind of no excuse for, like, the training side, right? You can AI a UGC avatar for your compliance program that's talking in front of the camera. You can just record a video yourself and send that out. Like, the bar for what we are willing to watch as, like, consumers of, like, data, whatever, of media, that bar has dropped so low. I mean, look at the TikToks you watch. I haven't even seen your history, Leslie. Some of those TikToks are low quality, okay? But I'm just saying, we spend hours watching this kind of stuff. So, like, that's how people are consuming stuff now. So why do we have to have this wildly higher bar? It's just a conveyance of information. It's just a conveyance of a little bit of a nugget that somebody can hold on to and apply when that situation comes up. If we're losing, again, there's so many TikToks that I watch, or, little short form videos I watch. It's a minute and a half and it conveys a concept perfectly. And I leave and I'm thinking about that concept for the next day. If we can't ourselves boil down the concept into a bite-sized piece that we can then iterate through and spray out across the organization, well, then we can leverage AI for that, right? Like, I'm just saying, there's always a way to solve the problem. And there's always a way to get that kind of an outcome that Leslie had, where compliance was viewed as less than, and now compliance is viewed as someone who can actually help. And wow, look how this person shows up. And wow, that was really meaningful. Again, this is not like turning a battleship, changing the brand or the impression within the organization in order to get the engagement we need, like you just said, to do our job, to crowdsource that risk intelligence and de-risk our organization, help our organization see around the curve. We have to get that engagement. And that's going to be a function of how we show up all the time.
No, I would agree. And, I would challenge everyone that's listening now to also think about too, one of the things that also used to drive me crazy is seeing the same issue on your compliance audit work plan for, like, 10 years, 6 years, 7 years. It's kind of like, well, do we ever get it right? Can we ever move on to the next level of risk? And I would challenge you to go back, like, especially for what I like to call repetitive or reoccurring risk, to couple some sort of education plan with it. Because lots of times, again, like you said, we're not going to de-risk the organization. But areas, if you're really taking a risk-based approach, your job is to mitigate the risk in that area, right? To assist with that. And so you want to look at the methods that you're using. And I would challenge anyone to go back and see. If you have a problem that's on your work plan consistently for the last 5 to 10 years, you may want to think about, what are we doing wrong here? What's happening? Why is it not improving? Not to say perfection, but improvement, right? And so education throughout my career has been, to me, it's half of the program. It should be half of the program, 50% education. So along with your auditing and monitoring should be some form of education. If you've identified it as a high-risk area for your audit plan, then that means it should be a high priority for education as well. And so I really love organizations, especially now, owning a consulting firm and working with many different organizations across the U.S., I love to see when they implement the idea, the recommendation of an education plan, because it's equally as important. It doesn't mean you need to educate on every single thing. Doesn't mean every item on your work plan requires it, but there are some high-risk areas that definitely should have that coupled with education, for sure.
Yeah, and just start to think through, like, think about it. Think about Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola doesn't just advertise in one way, just billboards. We're just a billboard. No, they do everything. They have signs at games. You know what I'm saying? They have product placement in freaking Fortnite, right? Like, there's Twitter ads. Like, they're coming across 1,000 different ways because they're trying to pierce that veil of attention. And we all have we as compliance officers have the exact same market as Coca-Cola. Right? Like, they're humans. They're just people. They're stakeholders in the, they're called stakeholders in the organization. They're called consumers outside of the organization, but it's the same human being. It's the same wiring. It's the same, veil of attention that needs to be pierced through. So we can pull, to your point about education, we can pull strategies and techniques from all over the place, right? I want to talk a little bit about, like, we've been talking about data a lot. How do we kind of start to measure some of this effectiveness? And I want to ask this in the context of kind of like a weight loss plan. What I see is a lot of people, first of the year, I'm going to the gym every day, and by 2 weeks in, everybody stops. And I think that's a function of us, like, not seeing the progress that we want to see, like, fast enough, right? And it's like, this isn't working. How can we kind of stay on our diet plan, our continuous improvement plan, by looking for some maybe more creative data points or some more creative sort of confirmations that our education is working? An example you gave, obviously, again, it's hard to quantify this, but just the fact that this group of doctors that were like stiff-arming compliance were now inviting compliance in, that's an indication to me that that education is working. Granted, that's anecdotal. It's harder to sort of measure. I mean, maybe you could tie some measure to it, but what are some of these things that we can look at so that we can have a little bit more grace for our initiatives, allow them to maybe take a little bit, allow for a little more time for these initiatives to actually take hold? Or how can we zoom in and notice some progression that we might otherwise not if we're sort of too fixed-minded?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that there's countless ways that you can use to measure. We just don't like talking about them sometimes. But for the purposes of education with the physicians, we actually use external audits to measure how well our education was sticking with our physicians over time. So we use targeted probe and educate reviews from Medicare. We also use some of the payer reviews that they were doing to measure all of the initiatives that we had put into place. So, of course, all of these, we couldn't measure it, week by week, month by month, but these external audit activity and, the ability to not have the same mistakes that, generated the first set of audits, maybe from last year or the previous year, was always a good metric for us. I think in general, there's a lot of ways, if you really think about it, ways for you to measure effectiveness and impact, which translates to return on investment. For instance, when I called myself a young compliance pup when I first was coming up. One of the things that I realized, we had this huge issue with outpatient audits. Even though it was a smaller amount of revenue, there was more external scrutiny. I mean, everybody and their mother was auditing the outpatient side. And so, I looked at the folks that were providing the coding and billing and realized that they weren't certified. And so I talked to the CFO and my boss at the time, the CCO, and said, why don't we start a coding school? Why don't we get these folks certified? And at first they kind of looked at me and then they said, you know what, that's a good idea. That's what we did. We got them, put them in school. got them certified, and then we measured the investment into them against external audit activity, and it was just astronomical. And I think, again, this is why risk-based approach are so important. It's like organization specific. What do I already have in my hands? What data do I have available to me that I can utilize? And kind of think outside the box. Whenever we think about measurement or metrics, we always think within what we have. But what external data could we be using? What external measurements that we receive anyway that we could be using to help us? And I think that's a good thing. I think other things are, behavior changes as well. For sometimes in compliance, we don't want to measure that, but that is a metric when it comes to you've provided education to an individual in a certain way about a thing, and let's see if they did it again, right? Like, for instance, I've been involved with cases where people, they'll get upset and they'll post something on social media, maybe about a boss or a coworker or whatever, and PHI is in there. Well, let's measure to see if they're doing it again. Let's actually go out there and see if they're doing it again. I think there's unique ways for you to use, to think outside the box when it comes to data to help you identify metrics.
But why do you think that's so hard for us to think outside the box? Or maybe if I can ask it a different way, when you were going to confirm if, the behavior change happened in the coding thing, in the coding example you just gave, were you doing that from a posture or from a perspective of, well, I need to justify this bet that I made? Or were you doing it more from a posture to say, I need to make sure that the thing I thought would happen did happen? Those are two different things. One is sort of trying to satisfy it for yourself, and one of it is sort of trying to satisfy it externally in the minds of leadership or some external party. Talk to me a little bit about that dichotomy and where we should be leaning or where we should be rooted.
So I started really positioning myself for a posture of effectiveness, right? I've always wanted to be effective. And I think lots of times I was misunderstood because I wanted to be more effective and impactful than I was just a compliance professional, right? It's one thing to get the CHC, it's one thing to get the degree, it's one thing to have the years of experience, but I don't think I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing if I'm not effective or impactful, and you can't see evidence of it. Now, that's not to say that I'm always going to see that, but that is my goal, right? My goal is within any organization is to show my value, my effectiveness, my impact. Long before we started talking about ROI, right, for return on investment for compliance, individually, I, Leslie Bowles, wanted to be effective and impactful. So if I set out and said, hey, this is a high-risk area and this coding and billing compliance area, and we're going to audit it, then we're going to provide education, that wasn't where I stopped, right? I came back to it. I came back to the recommendations. I came back to what you said you were going to do, and let's talk about it. And then if we need to have additional discussions to ensure that it's going well and we've mitigated the risk, that's what I wanted to do. And that's sometimes some people will look at that as, oh, you're being an overachiever. You're being overly ambitious. No, I just want to be effective. I want to be impactful. Even in compliance, I want them to show that you have us here in the compliance department, and this is what we're doing to mitigate risk for the organization. And so I think follow up, follow through, innovation is extremely important. And I would challenge some folks to think about their posture, right? Oftentimes, your outcome is embedded in you, in your posture. And if you don't care about it, then it's going to be outcomes are going to yield. I don't care.
Yeah, and if you do care about it, everything will, there will be so much evidence that you care about it. It's going to show up in how you show up. You know what I'm saying? It's going to show up in so many different ways.
Absolutely. So that was always my posture for sure. Yeah.
Great comment here in the chat. Thanks for sharing this. As a former director of billing, I put a billing certification program in place, and what a difference in the attitude as well as the skills from my billing team. They were so excited to get their coding certification as well as increase revenue and decrease waste and abuse. So again, that's a phenomenal win-win. That's a phenomenal reframe to that team, right? I mean, that's phenomenal.
For sure.
So I want to ask you, we've talked about this concept of like breaking out of the chains of like annual trainings, PowerPoint focused. You gave that phenomenal example of how you sort of like won over that physicians group. What other communication channels or what other communication modes that are maybe outside of the box, as you said, do you find are most effective in like maintaining ongoing compliance awareness just outside of those sort of annual click-through sessions? Let's not tell anybody I call those click-through sessions, okay?
that's what they are, but that's okay. One of the things that I really started to evaluate, and this is just me, again, this is my brain. I'm nosy by nature, so this is how I think. There was a time in my career where I came across an instance where we were getting these sort of like alerts from a quality standpoint about a physician who was just performing maybe too many episiotomies. And so there was this, this scurry to fix it. There was like this, oh, we've got to fix this. We've got to make this right. But yet this was still happening, right? And so I remember sitting at my desk and saying to myself, I wonder why he's doing episiotomies, though, when he performs, when he delivers babies. And come to find out, that is the way in which he was trained. He went to school in a region where the way in which they train their physicians to deliver babies is by performing episiotomies. That is how he was trained. That's how he was developed. He spent his whole career doing it. And so this aha moment just came off in my mind because it was like, man, we sat and talked to him and he explained all of that. And it made me realize that sometimes the cultural differences between us oftentimes they become ignored. It's not that we don't care. It's just we never take the time to ask, right? And so, right. As especially as we start talking about these things where quality and compliance come together, right? And you've got this new guidance that's talking about the importance of the intersection of quality and compliance. I think it's a really good time for compliance officers to start thinking outside the box because culture, training, there's all sorts of background. There's all sorts of things that affect or impact the delivery of care. And you want to start thinking more than just having the conversation about what we do. Maybe why do we do it this way? And sort of proactively identifying areas of risk from that way as well. But that was a big eye opener for me. I'll give you another one. And this is just reality. We don't like to talk about it, but I'll talk about it because, I work for myself, so I don't care.
Yeah.
There was a time point where, I realized that there was a particular physician, every time I spoke to him, he didn't receive me well. And I was just, it was bothering me. It was like, he just didn't receive me well. He did not I'll use the word respect. He was not really respectful of me. And I'm like, man, I'm planning for this. I'm preparing. I'm saying everything right. I'm getting feedback. I'm even practicing
Look at these nails.
With people. I'm doing all the things. But then I realized too, and this was really important for me, that I realized culturally, from where he was, it wasn't, women were not respected from an authoritative standpoint. And it was really important for me to have quality conversations with this individual. And so I had asked one of my colleagues at the time to sit with me in the meeting. And I found that the meeting was much more impactful. And so in that moment, for me as a compliance professional, sometimes I take myself outside of the equation, right? And I say to myself, we need to be impactful and we need to be effective, right? And despite how I'm feeling personally about this, right, I need to be effective and impactful. And I want to show that. And so in this instance, that was another outside the box way. What I realized in the moment that I did was I didn't buck the system to try to get him to do what I needed him to do so that I can feel comfortable about what I needed. I went another route, and that route worked. And sometimes you have to do that. I think we hit brick walls because our feelings and sometimes our emotions may get involved in the conversation and the discussion. And that can also take away from the impact and the effectiveness. So this is just my own personal experience. It's not everybody's experience. And some people may not agree, but I am a big advocate of impact. I'm a big advocate of being effective. And that's more important to me than anything. And so, yeah, I think there's numerous ways in which compliance professionals need to really sit and think about, what can I do differently? How can I view this differently? What am I missing when it comes to this area that I have an issue over and over and over again? So,
yeah, there's something in there that's causing that cycle to repeat, over and over again. And as you were talking about that situation, I mean, our natural desire is to like be the Hulk. It's like to be a sumo wrestler, to just, if you've ever seen a sumo match, I mean, they are just freaking smashing up against each other, trying to throw each other. That's not most effective for compliance, particularly given our power like dynamic in most organizations. And so I think instead of being a sumo wrestler, we need to be like an Aikido player. Aikido is a martial art that really uses the other person's energy against them. So if somebody's pushing you, you pull them. If somebody's pulling you, you push them. That is the opposite of sumo wrestling. And that's what you are able to do. You have that self-observation skill. You're able to step out of yourself and observe the situation sort of from a scientific, objective perspective and allow for yourself, your actions to be a lot more strategic and ultimately more impactful. But again, it takes us thinking outside the box. It takes us breaking some of those patterns that maybe have been ingrained in us for a long time. So we have like a minute or so left here. What time is it right now? Yeah, so we got a couple minutes left. The last question I have for you, Leslie, is let's just assume everybody we're talking to does not have, they didn't find the leprechaun yesterday, okay? They don't have the pot of gold. They got a lean team, okay? What would you tell them? How would you help them, or how would you instruct them, or, where would you direct them either for activities that can be better outsourced or leveraging technology to really drive more impact, keeping the resource set constant?
Mm-hmm.
Where are the biggest levers, the quickest levers to pull?
I think, right now, I know a lot of people they're not liking the idea of AI, but there are so many great artificial intelligence tools out there that can make your journey as a compliance professional, especially if you have a lean team, better. There are so many tools. And I think one of the things that compliance professionals should do now is evaluate them to see which one makes sense for some of the administrative tedious tasks that I think I need to hire an analyst for. What can I can use that skill set maybe towards something different. Maybe instead of an analyst, I can hire an educator, and that'll help mitigate risk in my organization versus having them doing back end data mining or tedious research work. There's a lot of AI tools that can help with that. And one point in my career, we actually created an internship program for our program, and it helped. It was it almost brings tears to my eyes thinking about the program, because it poured into the students, but it also helped our organization, and it was a great affiliation, and it showed those students something new in healthcare that they never even thought about before, and we received the help that we so desperately needed, being a lean team. And so I think there's all sorts of innovative ways where lean teams can use tools, both from a technology standpoint and, even students. There's great ways for you to utilize students, for sure.
So get those fresh eyes, put that beginner's lens on again, and reconsider your program and how you're showing up, how you're interacting with the business, because I guarantee you there's so many opportunities to make some small tweaks that are going to drive multiplicative, more impact in the organization. But it takes us recognizing that, first of all, life is a beautiful thing because you can do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. You're not captive based on the decisions that somebody else made before you, or even the decisions that you made last year, right? It's a game. Sure. It's a constantly evolving game. We have to be flexible. We have to be nimble, and we have to be creative. And I think when we can start doing that, we allow for a lot more sort of data points to enter our mind, and we allow for a lot more sort of problem solving that can ultimately happen, or that can often happen at the subconscious level. But again, if I'm right that we're hitting this inflection point, this potential kind of fork in the road, and our industry can really turn into everything we've dreamed it can be over the next 10 years, it's going to take us doing things differently. We can't just keep doing the things that we've always done. We can't keep plugging in a freaking PowerPoint training to a bunch of doctors. We're going to be on the phone the whole time. We have to be smart, and we have to be strategic with the scarce resources we have. So we're going to wrap up. Thank you. One more massive round of applause for Leslie Bowles, the one and only Leslie Bowles. Always a phenomenal guest, Leslie. Thank you so much. Follow Leslie. Find her on LinkedIn. Follow her. Her business is phenomenal. She helps a lot of healthcare organizations and a myriad of things that we just talked about today. So check that out. And Review Healthcare is what it's called. And so check her out on LinkedIn. And then Thursday, we have the benchmark report. Apparently, Navex heard about it, and they scheduled theirs at the same time. So we're going head to head on Thursday, benchmark report, going through that. And we'll see you next time. Take care.